everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Circle, a Container to Host Conversations That Matter. My name is Duncan Fields, and I'm a community animator with the Tamarack Institute, and I'm very excited to introduce today's discussion on the practice of Circle and the importance of conversations that matter with our speakers, Emilia Tamburini and Sylvia Chu. Now, before we get started, I just wanted to say that we want to begin this workshop by acknowledging that we are meeting on Indigenous lands. And as settlers, we're grateful for the opportunity to meet, and we thank all the generations of Indigenous peoples who have taken care of this land. As settlers, this recognition of the contributions and historic importance of Indigenous peoples must be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real within our communities. And I'm privileged to be calling in from the traditional land of the Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Now, I'm excited to also introduce our speakers for today. Emilia is the founder of Hum Consulting, a firm dedicated to hosting conversations that matter. She's passionate about healing the divisiveness in our communities and helping people uncover their interconnectedness, which she believes is essential for solving the very complex problems of today. Nothing lights Emilia up more than seeing communities and organizations transform to become agents of change. Sylvia is a consulting director of Tamarack Institute's Collective Impact Idea Area. She's passionate about community change and what becomes possible when residents and various sector leaders share an aspirational vision for their future. Sylvia believes that when the assets of residents and community are identified and connected, they become powerful drivers of community change. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks so much, Duncan.
Great to be here. Thanks, Duncan.
One of the things that I thought would be really cool was, yes, how about we do that? Do you want to give us an overview on all the folks that are joining us today?
Yeah, and as Sylvia was mentioning, it would be great if everyone could take a moment and reflect on the land that you're joining from. And if you're comfortable sharing that with us in the chat box, that would be really great to take that moment. As we do that, we're going to take a look at who's in the room with us today, because we have quite a diverse crowd joining us for this discussion. We have 425 learners from across Canada, the US, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, Singapore, the Philippines, Germany, Afghanistan, and beyond, and representing a variety of sectors, including nonprofit, the municipal government, provincial or state governments, consulting, Indigenous, post-secondary education, foundations, and health. So welcome, everyone. And if you don't see your sector or country represented on this map or slide here, we welcome you to share in the chat. So I'm going to pitch it over to you, Sylvia and Emilia, to take us through today's conversation.
Thanks so much, Duncan. So as I was chatting with Emilia to prep for today, one of the things that I shared is I too am a practitioner and deep believer in the power of circle as a container for really powerful dialogues. It is, while an ancient practice that's common to many cultural traditions, I think it has a unique ability to really invite in collective wisdom that is so important in these times when everything feels uncertain. And for more than a decade, I've had the privilege to be part of a local women's circle that has been meeting for years now. It is an anchor for me. It grounds me, it sustains me as I navigate all the different dimensions of my crazy life. And it is something to which I am eternally grateful. That's my wonderful circle sisters. And from our circle to this circle, I would like to share a beautiful poem that has inspired us. And it's from Corey Fisher, Albert Greenberg, and Naomi Neiman. Stories move in circles. They don't move in straight lines. So it helps if you listen in circles. There are stories inside and stories between stories, and finding your way through them is as easy and as hard as finding your way home. As part of the finding, there is the getting lost, and when you're lost, you start to look around and to listen. So, Emilia, tell us a little bit about you and what led you to this curiosity about circle and the importance of hosting powerful conversations.
Thank you, Sylvia, and thank you for that beautiful opening. I just love that. So I could probably start this answer in my childhood, but I'm going to start with these degrees in kinesiology and epidemiology, which really represent my evolving interest in human health, starting from those inner workings of the human body to the social and economic determinants of our well-being. And today that interest for me has really evolved into the ways in which we connect with one another. But all this just to say that underneath everything I do is this passion for health and wellness. And it's ultimately why I run circles today. But I'll take you on this quick journey. So after EPI, I worked in the field of health impact assessment for about 10 years. And in that experience, I got to engage with rural and Indigenous communities all over the world. And during this period, I learned so many things, but the things that really struck me was the impact that engagement in and of itself had on people and communities. And I noticed a couple things. One is that often people left these engagements not feeling heard and not feeling seen, but almost more interestingly, the processes in and of themselves often left people more divided than before, because there was time and space made for all these positions to come to the surface, but there wasn't time and space to get underneath it, to be like, why are those opinions there? And especially in rural and remote communities, you know, that sort of dialogue really left a lot of communities in this state of divisiveness. And so that was an interesting observation that I just sort of packed away. And during this time, I did get to work alongside Indigenous communities, and I really became fascinated with this whole concept of interconnectedness, you know, and how important that was to the health and well-being of individuals and families and communities. You know, that belief that we are actually not separate from one another or our environment, it just resonated deeply with me. So again, it was like a piece of information that I packed back here. And then in some of these situations, I did actually get to sit in a circle, and we got, you know, decision makers in the room and community was in the room. And sometimes, even though these people had been talking together for years, it was like when they got in this circular space, they could hear each other for the very first time ever, which resulted in us achieving outcomes that never would have surfaced had we engaged in other ways. So again, another piece of information that I was like, something is going on here in this circle space. So I did do some training in circle, and then I just fell in love with the whole concept, the inner workings, and the power of this tool. But then life went on, as it does, until I received my own personal pause in life with a diagnosis of Hodgkin's lymphoma. And for those of you on the call that, you know, have had cancer or are supporting people with cancer, you know that that disease, it both gives and it takes away. But the one thing that it really gave me clarity on was my life's purpose. And for me, that was simply to bring more love and more joy into the world, and ultimately more health and well-being. And I knew I was going to do that by using all of these life experiences and lessons to bring people together in ways that decreased divisiveness and increased our connection. And I knew that circle was the way to do that.
Emilia, I just wanted to thank you so much for weaving together so beautifully all these strands of your life that have led you right to this moment. I'm curious about why, from your perspective, you think circle is a practice that's particularly important for us right now.
Mm-hmm. Oh gosh, well, I love this quote by Margaret Wheatley, and she's relatively new to me, but I know that you, Sylvia, have been following her and working with her for some time. But what she wisely tells us in this quote is that we are not going to solve the complex issues of today if we keep doing things the way we have been doing them. You know, in fact, she suggests that we are only going to make things worse if we do this. And I agree. So consider for a second the three most recent experiences that we're faced with right now: COVID-19, the murder of George Floyd, and the attention that has brought to systemic racism all around the world. And then before all of this, and still ongoing today, is this global reckoning with the genocide of our Indigenous communities and our commitment to reconciliation. And so these are three very painful events, but they have been experienced globally. And yet individually, we have all been experiencing these things in our own way. And these experiences are unsettling, right? There's so much uncertainty, there's loss of control, there's a shift in power, and there is unresolved trauma at the base of it all. And so I really do think that to find our way forward to a future that doesn't look like the past, we really do need to find a different way. And I think people are eager for that. But you can already see that that's really hard for us, right? Because organizations and governments right now, like, what are they doing? They're getting busy and they're writing new policies and they're reforming law. And of course, you know, that's our comfort zone to take action. It gives us a sense of control. And there's also this real or perceived pressure that something needs to be done quickly. But I do believe we are going to miss the mark and possibly venture into more chaos, as Margaret says, if we don't take the time to heal, if we don't take the time for people to share their experiences and benefit from the collective wisdom of one another. And so I think to do this, I think we do need to slow down. We need to shift into a more feminine energy that invites in the storytelling and listening and tapping into our intuition and our creativity and building connection and community along the way. Because I think, like, for me, what has led us here is actually more of a spiritual crisis than anything else, meaning that we've been going about life seeing ourselves as separate from one another and our environment. And I think that is just simply not the case. And if we really want more equity, if we really want greater health and well-being and financial and legal reform that is actually going to make a difference, we need to rebuild that sense of connection. And I think that we do that, we get there by listening. And Circle, at its basic, is that it's creating that container for that listening to happen. And so that's why I think Circle is just such an amazing tool for right now.
Thank you so much. You know, as you were speaking, I was really reminded of a saying that Liz often calls forward, saying, you know, when the work we're about to do is really complex, then the tools we need to be working with need to be quite simple. And one of the things that I love is that in many ways, in my experience, creating the container of Circle is not necessarily a difficult thing to do. It's not the dominant thing that we're used to doing, so it feels different and strange, but it has an elegant simplicity to it that I think is really important. So I'm hoping you can walk us through what for you are some of the core practices and core principles that you rely on when you think about hosting a Circle dialogue.
Yeah, absolutely.
Kind of the how-to, right?
Yeah, exactly. So this is a taste of how-to, and then when we get to the end, I'll go through a little bit more practical stuff. But the practices, I feel like these are the things that we bring into Circle with us. Deep listening is number one, and your beautiful opening touched on this already. But this is a core practice of Circle. You know, it's simply about giving everybody in that space the gift of your attention. So, like, everybody on the call, think about this for a second. Any of us, I feel, are lucky enough to have one or two people in our lives that simply listen as we share. You know, there's no advising, there's no coaching, there's no interrupting or planning their responses, right? And we all know what that feels like. In the chat box, I'd love to hear, like, what does it feel like to be able to just talk and be listened to? For me personally, it's a luxury to talk with these people. It's like going to a spa, you know, it's just so relaxing. So when we're in Circle, we're literally just doing that. We're giving each other this gift and also treating ourselves to that experience. And when we do that, that's when we uncover these threads that connect us. And I think this is the part of Circle that most people find so enticing. And when they leave, they want more of that. And so that's a core practice. The second one is curiosity, which is highly related to listening. But when we sit in Circle, we're asking a lot of open-ended questions. And when we listen to each other's responses, we must do that with an open heart. And I think one of the best ways to keep our hearts open is to be curious. Curious about what that other person's experience is, but also curious about ourselves, like, what is it I want to contribute to this space? What is my intention for saying what I'm about to say? What's that reaction going on in my belly right now? Did I eat something bad for lunch, or am I being impacted in some way by what has been said? So I think when we're sitting in circle, we're raising our awareness, both of ourselves and others, and curiosity really allows us to do that in a gentle way. And then the third practice is speaking from the heart. And I think this is really about speaking with intention. In one circle that I participate in, the running joke is that once you feel that unease in your throat or belly, that's your sign to share. And I think what this really is it's a sign that you've transitioned out of your head and you're ready to share from a deeper place. And this is all about contributing what needs to be said in the moment. It's not about agreeing. It's not about giving philosophical theses on things. It's not about defending or arguing against somebody else's point. It's simply about speaking what is coming up for you in the moment. So those are the practices. In terms of the principles, I see these as the truths that these are just the truths that are uncovered when we sit in circle, but also that we must tend to when we are in circle. And the first is that we are all knowledge keepers. We all have experiences and stories, and in circle, those are honored. And you couple that with this shape of the circle, and power differentials just sort of dissipate, which really opens up this door for expansive conversation and shifts in perspective. And the ways that we tend to this in circle often is by the use of a talking piece. We did that at least pre-COVID. I'm not sure what we will do post-COVID. But when you are holding that talking piece, essentially you are the knowledge keeper and people are listening to you and your knowledge. And then when you are complete, you pass that talking piece to the person next to you and you're saying, okay, now you're the knowledge keeper. I want to learn from you. And it's just such a sweet process. The second principle is that we are all connected. And in those years of doing community engagement, when we actually did get underneath all the opinions and the positions of people, what emerged were core themes. There was a desire to feel safe, a desire to be seen, a desire to belong. We all share those desires regardless of where we live, our ethnicity, our age, or how much money we make. And I think as that talking piece goes around in circle, those positions, they dissipate and these core desires emerge. And that is where we find these threads that really connect us. And the way in which we tend to that principle is really by going back to this practice of speaking from our heart, because if we speak from our heads, we will stay separated. And then this last principle is about we are all responsible. And that's a hard pill to swallow sometimes. But I think, in my opinion anyways, collective responsibility really is our way forward to the world that we all want to live in. And circle gives us practice in that, because not one person is accountable for the integrity of the circle or its outcomes. Everybody in the circle holds that responsibility. And we tend to this principle through the making of agreements. So for example, just making it clear that everyone can call the circle back to focus if it has veered off track, or if curiosity has exited stage left. Everybody plays a role in keeping circle going. So these are the principles and practices that I relate to. And just to say that, practices take practice. This is not about perfection, it's about progress. And it's an intent. And these principles are really the energetic hold that exists within circle and that we're just unearthing.
I know in the circle training that I was part of, there's a role of someone who is called the guardian. And it can be a rotating role, but it is that designation that you're really listening for and watching the flow, and those principles, with full permission to ring a bell, which we've pre-decided is the collective signal to pause and take a breath. And I sometimes have found that to be really, really helpful, knowing that also as someone in the circle, I can call the guardian to ring if need be. And some of the most powerful moments of it are not necessarily about calling us back because we are not abiding by the principles, so sometimes that does help. It's also about inviting us to pause and be in silence, because silence is also really powerful, right? And so when someone says something incredibly profound that you found, involved true that heart, that risk and that fear, but the courage to speak it anyway. There's the power of the bell inviting us all to just sit in silence for a minute and let that soak in before we leap to the next thing. As someone sort of growing up in a North American culture where that is not the norm, those reminders, I think, are really, really helpful. So can you share with us some of your own experiences in how you have used Circle to host really powerful conversations, and what those experiences have taught you and affirmed for you?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to say, I love these comments coming in about the importance of listening and how that feels when we do have those people in our life. It's just beautiful. To be listened is to be loved. Oh, I love that. So on this slide, I've just listed here some areas that I have been involved in Circle. But I want to spend most time going through an example, but I'll go through each of these quickly. And if there's any area that somebody wants to really dig deeper into, I think we're going to have lots of time in the question and answer period. So just quickly, decision-making processes, structures or processes where there's a diversity of makeup. So for example, any sort of committee or board or a planning committee for municipal and industrial decisions, as well as the community engagement that goes alongside that. So for an example, right now I'm working with this project where a city is redeveloping 3 plots of land, and the planning committee is comprised of a First Nation, the city, the school district, and a provincial housing organization. And there we are collectively using Circle in the planning process for that community development project. Yeah. Restorative justice is another great place where Circle can be used, where a harm has been committed and responsibility needs to be taken and agreements need to be made. Circle has been used in that arena for a really long time. Team building, oh my gosh, I feel like Circle is a fabulous replacement for the regular team meeting, especially if you really want to deepen the relationships within your team. Support is a fabulous tool, and both you and I are part of women's circles. I'm also part of a cancer circle. And these are just really great spaces to connect and step out of isolation in a lot of cases. And I think this type of circle is actually really important for youth. In the school setting, it can be very effective, and use it to delve into those spaces of anxiety and all those other issues that adolescents face. And then celebration. Oh my gosh, we don't celebrate enough. I feel like Circle is such a beautiful tool for celebration, and I try to incorporate it into any circle that I run, but certainly reunions, birthdays, end of life. I'm on a personal mission to transform all weddings that I attend into Circle dialogue. Okay, but I want to walk through an example of education and awareness because I feel like it's just such a relevant example for the types of things that we're dealing with today. But in the chat box, feel free to write other examples about where you use Circle or where you think it can be used. I think that'll be really supportive for people on the call. So Greater Victoria Acting Together is an organization that's all about bringing diverse organizations together to create change around issues that are impacting the community at large. And the member base is very diverse. There's faith-based groups, there's environmental and housing advocacy organizations, there's labor unions, there's education, there's, yeah, lots of diversity. So way back in 2018, they were hearing from their members how concerned they were about the impact of the opioid crisis on their organizations. And each organization was being impacted in their own way as a result of this crisis. And they also knew it was impacting the community at large. And so they wanted to explore if this was potentially an issue that they could collectively take action toward. But, you know, the issue is very complicated to talk about because of the stigma associated around it. People didn't want to say the wrong thing. There was a lot of confusion around addiction and what it is and what it isn't. And it was also really felt that to move forward, there was a need to take responsibility for the state of things in the community, that somehow collectively, as a society, that we had all contributed to this crisis, which of course involved layers of social isolation and poverty and racism and trauma and so on, not so dissimilar from the issues that we're facing today. And so because of this complexity and because of this need for healing, they knew that before they went about making action plans and collectively addressing this crisis, that they first had to stop and listen. And so as a starting point, they decided to bring all member organizations together and have an evening that was solely focused on learning about how the crisis was impacting each of the members. And the intent of this night was really to deepen understanding and to strengthen relationships so that these steps could be taken to actually affect change in the community. So I do think this educational awareness raising / relationship building gathering is a great use for Circle, and it's really a great first step for so many of the challenges that we are facing today. So everyone entered the room. There was about 50 people in the room. The hosts welcomed people to that space. They grounded people in the intention of that night. And then they had representatives from a few organizations share what their experiences were. So there was a first responder, there was a frontline service worker from a shelter, and there was a mom who had lost her son in the crisis. And so after all of those people had shared their stories, there wasn't a question and answer period, and they didn't just send everybody home, which is very common actually after a panel. Instead, they welcomed everybody to sit in small circles and reflect with each other on what they had learned. And they asked 3 questions. What has touched you? Has your perception of opioid use and its impact on our community changed? If so, how? And where do you see hope? And the night was really quite special. So many people had walked into that room with really strong opinions about who the addicted were or the drug users were. And in some cases, there was a real lack of compassion. But as people started to share their own experiences in these small groups, you know, parents were sharing their worries of their own child's mental health challenges, and others shared their own experiences of being addicted to pain medication. But suddenly things transformed and people started to see themselves in those who were suffering. And that fear around homelessness and addicted populations transformed into this collective desire to raise awareness about these issues that the community was facing. So that's just one example, and I hope you do find it relevant. But I think what all of these examples share, where Circle really works, is where there are diverse experiences, where there are differing of opinions, and where there is this deep knowing that listening would actually be of some benefit. Or another way to put that is that there is a desire for connection. And I think if you create that space where people can comfortably listen to each other and feel safe enough to share their own story, then you can get to more connection and collaboration and innovation empowerment and sustainability, both in terms of groups being able to function for longer periods of time, but also decisions that are more sustainable because they actually address core needs. And then finally, wellness, because I think that when we're more connected to ourselves and those around us, we are just simply healthier.
That's so beautiful, Emilia. I have a question. So I'm thinking about all the different folks that I saw on the list coming from all sorts of different places. So say I wanted to incorporate a circle dialogue into some of the work that I'm doing or get it started. Are there some really practical pieces of advice or tips, around how you structure it, what's important about the composition of the circle? How do you create the ground rules around, what happens, what's okay, what's not okay? Like the nuts and bolts, how does it work?
The nuts and bolts. Well, if we can go, into this next question, then this is going to be all about that. So this is my favorite slide in the presentation because I'm Italian.
It looks delicious. It's lunchtime for me.
Yeah, and I'm Italian, so I need food in every presentation. But this slide also shows us what circle looks like. So if you remember anything at all during this presentation, remember this slide, because essentially this is what you're aiming to recreate. Forget about the naan bread on the side. I haven't figured out how to work that into this analogy. But that circle of small plates, that's what you're going to recreate. So you're sitting in chairs or you're sitting on the floor in circle without tables. In the center there, those aren't tables. Those are something that you want to ground into. So maybe you place your organizational values in the middle, or a few trinkets that remind you of who you want to be in this space together. And when I get to the next slide, I have a picture of an example of something that I've used in the past there. But let this image be your guide. The other reason I love the food analogy is because I think of hosting a circle like you're hosting a dinner party. So yes. So just like you would be hosting a dinner party, there are various things that you need to work through. But first and foremost, the role of a host of a circle is to prepare and hold space for the conversation to occur and to hold space for the participants. So you're a space holder in that role. So you're planning your party, you're planning your circle. The first thing to do is figure out the logistics. So who needs to be there? What is it that you will be talking about? Where is the best place to host? And I'll get into that a little bit more later. When is the best time? Is now the right time? Are you going to have one circle, or are you going to have many circles? And then why? Why is really important. This is about checking back in with your intention, because intention shapes the energy of the gathering, and it's what you're going to convey in your invitation out to people. So maybe you have an intention to relate, or to connect, to learn, or to expand. These are all intentions that will create really impactful conversations. Then you want to do your preparations. If you're hosting a party, you would make sure your space is tidy. You'd put the toilet paper roll on the thingamabobber in the bathroom. And same thing here for circle. You want to make sure your space is comfortable. And you also want to find a space where you can get your chairs in a circle. And this actually can be one of the biggest challenges of hosting a circle, because so many rooms have big boardroom tables nailed to the ground. And I think that is just so indicative of our comfort with barriers in our conversations. But be creative. Right now, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, it's summer, so outside is a fabulous option. But rec rooms, gymnasiums, cafeterias. I don't know if Sylvia, you have other suggestions for great locations for circle?
Just open spaces, right? People, like for my own women's circle, we rotate, or we were when we were not doing it virtually, right? Between different people's homes. So the burden is shared around the host role. But yeah, outside in nature is always a beautiful preference when the weather permits. but you got to have a fallback, right?
Yes, yes. Yeah, so space is important. And then there's invitations. And invitation is really about clearly articulating what your intention is and what people can expect from the space. And sometimes this requires a few more one-off conversations with people just to really get clear on what Circle is all about and make sure people are comfortable. And then lastly, you want to prepare yourself, right? Because you're the space holder for this circle. And so sometimes it's nice to take a few deep breaths or take a walk, or maybe you have a meditation that you listen to really just center your energy as you come in and host your circle. Okay, so you've got the logistics and the preparations. Now you're ready for your party, you're ready for your circle. And of course you want to greet people as they enter. But then once people are seated, it's really nice to have an opening, something that will remind people of why it is you have gathered, and also help people transition, right, from the worlds that they have just come from, which tend to be very much more hectic. And so this can look like many, many things. A few deep breaths. You might have a moment of silence or light a candle. Just like you did, Sylvia, you might want to read a quote or a poem to start off your circle. I know I don't leave home without my Mary Oliver and Richard Wagamese in my back pocket. And then you want to create a safe space. And I think this here is just a reminder to say that this space is actually very vulnerable for many people, right? We're so comfortable with barriers. We like tables in between us. We like sitting at the back of the room in presentations. And we're not so comfortable sitting where we can be 100% seen. So you really do want to make sure that there's that element of safety, and that's through both the energy that you bring in, but also through the development of agreements. And these are collectively agreed upon principles that all people will agree to, adhere to when you are in circle together, you know, and that comes back to this collective responsibility. And the principles and the practices that we went through, those are a great place to start. And we're also going to link you with this great resource by Kay Pranas, who's a longtime circle host. And she has this great handout that she created, which is all about how to host circles online, which is so super relevant for right now. You actually don't need a physical space. You can use these platforms like Zoom to do this. But in that document, she gives great examples of agreements as well as questions to ask. And she talks quite a bit about intention setting. So I love this resource. And you'll get that in the package afterwards. And the last thing here is really about letting go of control. And I put a smiley face there because I was like, oh my gosh, people are like, what, Emilia? You know, I'm done with no control. I've been doing that for months. And I just encourage you to keep going with it, because there is this element of uncertainty in circle. You never know where this dialogue is going to go. But if you can allow for that uncertainty, then you will be in for a real treat. Like, think about it. If we go back to this dinner party analogy, it's like that unexpected guest who shows up at your dinner party and ends up being the matchmaker, and then they stay and they help you clean up the dishes. And, you know, it wasn't expected, but it was a really nice surprise. And I think in Circle, there are so many nice surprises if you allow yourself to let go. And I do think that comes back to this question of who. And who specifically, who is the best person to host the circle. So especially in these really contentious issues that some of you might be facing, you know, in some cases, you might know that you're too close to the issue, or that you're just one of those people that are going to micromanage the conversation, or maybe you're not seen as neutral. That's really important in a lot of communities. It's like, how are you perceived in this space? And so sometimes it's more beneficial to have another community member or another person in your organization to host. And sometimes it is worth it to bring somebody else in from the outside, at least to get you going. But your heart will tell you what is the best thing to do. So this is a lot. Sylvia, I'd love to know your thoughts, but I just want to say that you don't have to do all of this. You know, even if you picked one thing that you wanted to implement and bring it into your next meeting or your next gathering, like for example, just simply setting your intention before you walk into a meeting. And you will automatically start to see changes, I guarantee that.
I love that you've given us all permission to just dip the toe in, you know, start with a really intentional opening in a traditional meeting. And that in and of itself can be really powerful. I have been watching and so excited to see, we already have 11 questions in our question box.
Amazing.
And so without any further delay, I am going to really encourage us to maybe move to taking a look at what are the questions that are coming in. I know, Duncan, we've asked you to sort of pay attention to that a bit and work with us around what are some of the maybe the themes that we're seeing, and I just want to make sure we leave lots of time for those. So over to you. What are the questions showing up?
Yeah, thank you both for that wonderful conversation, and thanks to everyone who has shared their questions so far. If you haven't, you can use the Q&A panel at the bottom of your Zoom client, and even if you don't have a question, you can still go there and use the thumbs up feature to vote on which questions speak to you. Our first question comes from Mike, and they ask, what would you suggest are key resources and or training available to learn how to conduct Circle effectively?
Yeah, I love this question. So I'll speak to the organizations that I have benefited from. The first one is the One Circle Foundation, and they're based out of the United States, but they do trainings all throughout North America. And right now they've actually done an awesome job at transitioning all their trainings online. So you can go there and sign up, and they're really focused on youth. So if you are curious about how to bring Circle into schools or youth groups, they're a fabulous organization. And then I would also like to recommend a piece of the Circle. And again, she's Evelyn Zellaher is based in Vancouver, but she travels all over the world doing Circle training, and her training is fabulous. It's absolutely transformative, and I can put those in the chat box.
And I would add to that the work of Christina Baldwin and Anne Linnea through Peer Spirit Circling, and they've done a lovely summary of the core practices for designing a circle. I know there's a book that's a bit more dated called Calling the Circle, which was my first sort of opportunity to get all excited about this. They do offer training, and they have a Circle Way network of consultants and facilitators around the world who often come together and offer trainings as well. So I'll add a link there as well for that.
Yeah, thank you both. That's very helpful. Our next question comes from Kristen, and they ask, how do you get a cross-section of community members to participate in a circle when some may be resistant to the process or engaging with others who have very different views?
Yeah, it's such a good question. Prep work is so important in Circle. And as much as we like to just go right to the actual circle, sometimes it takes quite a bit of time to meet with people, you know, and really anytime you're meeting with people, you are in circle. So you can take all of the principles that we talked about, you know, setting your intention and really welcoming that person or individuals into a conversation that allows them to go deeper and support them to get underneath their positions by asking these very open-ended questions. I think those taking the time to meet one-on-one with folks and explaining the theory, what it is and what it's not, and of course allowing people. What I didn't say is that you don't have to share in circle. You can just sit there. There's always the opportunity to pass, and so really keeping that space safe, both through that and as well as co-creating those agreements, which you can start to do when you have those one-on-one conversations before you gather people together. I don't know if Sylvia, you have any other suggestions?
Sometimes I wonder about, you know, is it useful and helpful to experience a circle with folks that are like you and like where you do feel safe? and maybe circles within groups is an important sort of precursor to coming together to a more diverse and or mixed circle, because then you don't feel that vulnerability in the same way, because you know that you're coming in with others who can speak powerfully. And also having the experience of circle, different than hearing about it, because the experience of it touches your head and your heart, whereas when you're learning about it, it's all in your head. And so having a safe experience might create enough confidence and clarity to then safely move into a more diverse circle, because it is a practice that we're not familiar with, but it feels very familiar, like you're returning home when you're actually in a good one. And I would also say, if there's a lot of frustration or uncertainty, are there safe ways to let people see and experience and witness circle without feeling the pressure of having to speak and be a full participant? That might also help as well.
Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. Our next question is from Kristen again, and they ask, can you share more about how circles can catalyze action? Many folks in our community are tired of talking just to talk, in quotation marks, and want to know how a circle process can lead to action.
Yeah, I feel like it's, let me think about this for a second. What comes to me is it's really about the questions that you ask and explore and bring into circle. And those questions can, yes, be very exploratory and help people unearth things. And then they can actually transition into more action items like, okay, so what is our first action step? What comes to you? And have that go around. You can also break in and out of circle. So I work a lot. Sometimes we start in circle, we sort of set the energetic tone, but then we're also doing flip charting and strategic planning. And then we come back into circle if things are a bit unbalanced, or we just sort of allow for that diversity. But I think circle is a great tool for strategic planning, especially if you really want input from all the diverse voices around the table. So I think that comes down to the question and a bit of the design.
I would echo that and say that, sometimes questions can be, what are some things that I can think of that I might do, right? As an individual, what are things that I might do based on what I've heard tonight? What would I like to offer? What would I like to ask for? And just creating space for that. But then also, what can we as organizations do? What can we as families do? Right, so it's really just calling us all out and reminding us that we don't need permission necessarily, but it is important to be given some space and time to think, and a nudge, I guess, to think and to explore what might be possible. And it isn't necessarily prescriptive and saying we must all agree before we move forward, but really sort of reminding us of all the roles that we hold. We're not just our position in an organization. So what are some things that we can commit to based on what we've heard? And I think that that's actually a really helpful way to ground people as well.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And I will say that it's important not to rush it. I hear what you're saying about oh my gosh, can we just get on to the action? And that sometimes you just need to sit in that other space for quite a bit of time, because there is healing to do around so many of these issues.
Thank you. Those are both really thoughtful answers. Our next question comes from Melissa, and they ask, what's your advice for gently moving the circle along when someone is taking lots of time and space for their turn?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in part, I think that does come back to agreements, and that's why it's nice to have them, because you can gently just bring people back to say, hey, I'm noticing you have a lot to say on this issue, and we value that, and in our time, because we are bound by time generally when we sit in circle, we'd love to give everybody an opportunity to hear. And so, and maybe that is one of your agreements as well, that time of all people are, the time is just respected as you go forward. Yeah, I think coming back to the agreements, and then, you know, just gently honoring what that person is saying and their energy around it, and the fact that everybody's voice is here to be heard.
And this is, for me, another place where that having that guardian role as a rotating role is something that's really useful. Because if we've talked about the time constraints and what we're trying to say or do, you know, there is a moment where we could do a ring and just acknowledge that, you know, it's really important, but I'm personally feeling the tension of wanting to really honor what's being said and also give everyone an opportunity to speak. And so you're just owning that and saying, is there anything we can, you know, so just inviting us all to be mindful.
Yes.
That's it.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And again, it's around your intention about what you're saying. So we're not shaming people for over speaking. This is just, you're making an observation and you're speaking what you're feeling in the moment.
Wonderful. Our next question comes from Susan, and they ask, how would you deal with someone who is really angry, which might come from their life situation, frustration, etc.?
You know, this is again where I think sometimes the setup can be really helpful. And so, you know, when you were showing those beautiful centers, right, that often are a visual anchor that you create into the center, you know, if you were going to invite people to sort of put their name in the center or something so that they feel like the center is theirs as well. I think, you know, those setup pieces may distill some of the anger. And then I think, again, it's that place where you acknowledge what you've heard, right? That the container here is saying, yes, you know, we see and we witness your anger. We know it's there. Thank you for trusting the circle to hold that anger for you. What is it that you think is the most important piece? Or, you know, just trying to invite them to sort of anchor it back to the broader conversation. What's the key takeaway that's most important for us in this circle to hold in terms of honoring that anger? Something like that just allows the person to still have control of sort of the narrative and to feel heard, but not necessarily allow us all to be hijacked by it, because we need to work through it and it will show up. So being able to model that anger can be held in the circle is probably a beautiful thing.
Absolutely. It is actually fairly common for shadow to come out in circle because people don't have these spaces very often to tap more into what's happening for them in their heart. And if there is an angry outburst, sometimes, again, it's nice to have that guardian where the bell can be rung and there's just a pause taken, or maybe you want to take a break and then come back to circle afterwards.
Perfect. I think we have time for one more question, and it's actually from an anonymous attendee. And they ask, how does circle dialogue intersect with Indigenous ways of knowing? And what do ethics look like in this intersection? As a non-Indigenous person, I would be cautious using this approach. Can you speak to this?
Yeah. Well, I think that, I mean, circle is rooted in Indigenous ways of being. So it is a gift that has been given from those cultures. And I think it's important to honor that. And I think Indigenous and non-Indigenous people are able to do that. And you can do that in many different ways. I think a traditional territorial acknowledgement absolutely is a beautiful way to ground you in that space and that knowing that this way of being is a gift. I rely on the people who have trained me, who work quite a lot with Indigenous community and the Indigenous communities that I work with, and then they have all been very open to me as a non-Indigenous person, bringing this process into community. And I think it is about checking in on some level too with the people that you're working with to make sure that it is an okay thing for that particular group.
And I would just add to that that one of the things that I'm forever struck by is there isn't one knowledge tradition within and amongst Indigenous people, and so I wouldn't want to presume that there's one kind of answer. I think that, you know, there is a lot of circle practice embedded into Indigenous ways of knowing and leading together, and so it would really be about working with Indigenous folks to really understand that intersection better, and, you know, exploring. You were asking questions about the ethics, right, of that and taking care of that intersection. So I would really pay attention to the principles and the agreements that you set, and the degree to which they align with the knowledge keepers and tradition of the Indigenous communities you're working with.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Part of your groundwork.
Yeah, no, those are beautiful answers. So thank you for that. Unfortunately, it does bring us to time. So I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank you, Emilia, for joining us today and sharing your wisdom, and Sylvia for bringing us through this conversation.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
And thank you for hosting us so well, Duncan.
Yes.
Yeah, my pleasure. I do have a couple quick announcements. Through the month of July, the Tamarack Institute is bringing you weekly community building webinars, and we have some really exciting things on the calendar coming up. On the 22nd, we've partnered with the Canadian Council of Youth Prosperity to learn about what it means for youth to be part of a virtual workforce. Later, you can join Liz Weaver and Sylvia as they share 3 tools for navigating change and moving from response to resilience. And we also have conversations with Lisa and Kimber from Tamarack Institute on engaging youth. And if you can't join the event live, you can still register and get a full recording of the discussion. As well, we recently launched a new online course called The Foundations of Community Engagement. You can join us for a self-directed online course that allows you to build your engagement toolkit at your own pace. And you can engage with pre-recorded videos, resources, case studies, and a course workbook, and get more personalized feedback during monthly small group coaching opportunities with the course instructor, Lisa Adagala. Again, thank you so much for everyone who joins and shared your thoughts and questions with us. In a few days, you'll receive a follow-up email, which will include a link to the audio recording of today's call, a video recording of today's call, as well as the learning opportunities I've just mentioned. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.